And hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today, and welcome to the third event organized by the Space Arbitration Association this year. It is the third event of a new series we are organizing this year with the aim of putting the focus on the development of space activities around the world. And as Thorsten mentioned, today we will focus on Africa, and we have three guests from very different regions of Africa who can give us an overview over what's happening in their regions and their personal stories. So we have with us Ruvimbo Samanga, Joshua Faleti, and Joan Chesoni, and I will introduce them quickly before we can dive into the discussion. So Ruvimbo Samanga is a space policy analyst with experience in the African and global space sector. She sits on the board of our Space Arbitration Association, and she has supported a number of international initiatives in policy, business, outreach, and education geared towards the advancement of space and satellite applications for sustainable development. She currently serves as an ambassador for the Milo Space Science Institute and previously served a 2-year term as the national point of contact for Zimbabwe in the Space Generation Advisory Council, which is in support of the United Nations Programme on Space Applications. She is the recipient of the International Astronautical Federation's Young Space Leader Award and is a Mandela Washington Fellowship alumnus. Joshua Faleti is a lawyer who writes about space. He began his professional activities in the African space industry as an analyst at Space in Africa before moving to SpaceWatch Global for a global understanding of space. Prior to this, he participated in the African regional rounds of the Manfred Lux Space Mood Competition, co-developing the competition's best written memorials. He earned his LLB from the University of Ibadan in Nigeria and is a trustee of the Learned Space Foundation. And Joan Chesoni is a state counsel for the Republic of Kenya. She advises the government of Kenya on aviation, space, and government commercial transactions, specifically public-private partnerships. Currently, she is the director on the board of the Kenya Space Agency, where she alternates the Attorney General. She's a Carmen Fellow of 2023 and the Global Alumni Representative on the Board of Trustees of the International Space University, as well as a UN Space for Women mentor also in 2023. So as you can see, we have a great panel today. So we are looking forward to an interesting discussion. I apologize. So I think we can start the discussion with a more personal question, and I would like to ask each of our guests today to tell us a little bit about their current work and about how they started to work in the space industry. And maybe, Ruvimbo, we can start with you. So based on what I know about your profile, you started to work in space directly after graduating. So I think this is an interesting path to take, and I would be happy if you could share a little bit about how this happened. So over to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's an esteemed pleasure to be here with my colleagues. I think much in the same way as Josh, my career began with the Manfred Lux Space Law, with the Manfred Lux Space Law Moot Court competition, which more or less served as my career launchpad. From then, I've sort of learned on the go through fellowships and internships, as well as some full-time roles, starting, of course, with the Open Lunar Foundation, and then following through to full-time roles at Space in Africa and then Access Partnership. I currently serve as an ambassador for the Milo Space Science Institute, which is creating affordable access to space through a dedicated and tailored missions academy. One way I think in which my personal development really came about was through the online and in-person networking, which I used to my benefit, which would of course be social media and LinkedIn, and also conference attendance, and as well taking part in other professional development opportunities with NGOs such as the Space Arbitration Association as well. But I would say my career really came about as a result of putting myself out there and creating my career as I went along.
Thank you very much. Joan, could you maybe share how you got involved with space law?
Thanks, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists. So my story is a bit different from Ruvimbo's. As you stated, I'm a state counsel for the Republic of Kenya. So at the master's level, I actually studied air and space law. I hold an advanced master's degree in air and space law from the University of Leiden. And I actually got into the program because I was doing a lot of aviation policy and legal and regulatory reform advisory for the government in Kenya. So somewhere midway through my career relating to aviation practice, I decided I needed to skill up. And when I opted to go to Leiden, the master's program, as you know, is combined. It's a master's in air and space law. And actually, I enjoyed the space law segment, but at that point in time, Kenya did not have a program that was leaning towards civilian use of civilian engagement rather in the space economy. Our space program was primarily a defense program located within our military, and so it was not open to civilians. And I'm a civilian. So when I came back home after my master's, there was a policy decision that had been made to actually set up the Kenya Space Agency. And I was asked to represent the Honorable Attorney General on the board. So on the inaugural board, so it's been a steep learning curve of 5 years where we had to set up an agency, work on the legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as create a space within which then we will develop the space program in a way that it can be commercially viable in Kenya. So briefly, that's my story. And of course, in the course of time, as part of my board role duties, I've been involved in several forums where I've had to engage on matters relating to space and what Kenya actually has set out as her goals within the space sector. So briefly, that's it. That's how I got involved. And like everyone who's in space always had a childhood dream about, being involved in the space sector. But hey, I live in Africa, so it was a dream. So for me, I think I would say I'm living my dream. And yeah, that's basically how I got to where I am.
Thank you. And it's very interesting to see that this is really a sector where things are happening now. No? So if you really want to move something, I think being in space is a really, really interesting career choice. And Josh, could you also tell us a little bit about yourself?
Thank you very much, Laura. It's nice to be amongst this wonderful panelists and Austin, my colleague, if I could call him that. Much like everyone who really is in space, I got into space because I love space. I've always loved space as a child. I remember when I was 7, 8, I read this book told me about Orion constellation, and then I went out at night and then I saw Orion, and it connected with me fundamentally. It was nice to be able to see something in the book and then look up in the stars and say, but because like Joan, I wanted to be a lawyer because I really didn't know space was a professional, space offered professional opportunities, and what I was much younger then. But I eventually went on to study law. But somewhere down the line, I did know that law wasn't really, in as much as I liked law, I needed to do something I enjoyed. And then I thought to myself, if there's space, then there should be law for space. And then I went on to search about it, and then I found space law. This led me to the map and Lack Space Competition, which officially, like much like Ruvimbo, officially kickstarted my career as well. So this helped me meet friends, my first friends and connections in space, in professional area of space. After my friend Lax, I finished my legal degree. I got called to bar in Nigeria, so I'm a lawyer. But I worked in space in Africa instead. I worked much like Ruvimbo did. I worked as an analyst, a writer, and in some ways a consultant, an in-house consultant. So after that, I realized that I wanted to, like I said in my biography, I wanted to get a more global and a more global perspective from Europe. And SpaceWatch offers me the right platform to do that. So I'm currently in SpaceWatch, and I'm eternally grateful to Thurston for the opportunity. Other than that, I've also tried to do a few things personally on my end, in the space industry. But generally, that's my journey so far. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It's very interesting. So with this, so you've shown that you are all very interested in space and working in this sector. So I would like to hear a bit about your views on how the space industry is developing in Africa. So obviously it's a continent. There are probably a lot of differences between the different countries. So when we were selecting the panelists for this event, we tried to have a regional representation to cover different parts of Africa, but keeping in mind that you probably know more about your own country and your own region, maybe you can focus on those regions. And so I would like to ask you if you could give an overview of how the space industry is developing in your country and your region, and what are the main projects and objectives that we can expect in the coming years. So maybe we can start with Joan. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the activities of the Kenya Space Agency at the moment, and how it has developed and what its plans are for the future.
Thank you very much, Laura. So I think generally I'd say as a whole continent, Africa is starting to really realize the impact of space technologies on development. And so right up from the African Union level, as part of our agenda concerning the Africa that we want, so AU Agenda 2063, we actually have the African Space Policy and the African Space Strategy. And as you know, we have the African Space Agency that is going to be hosted in Egypt. So there's a lot of work going on at the continental level, which I think being championed through the auspices of AU would be a great unifying factor, because you're right, regionally, in terms of legal and regulatory frameworks within Africa, we're quite diverse. So we do need a unifying factor to be able to pursue a single a strategy that will actually benefit the continent as a whole. So coming down to Kenya, a bit of history, small fun fact, space activities have been taking place in Kenya since the 1960s, so that makes it about 60 years. And this started off at a point in time just before independence, when the Italian government actually identified a location off the Kenyan coast as a location where they could set up an offshore platform for launch. And then shortly after, they moved into that section, because at that point in time, those were international waters. Kenya got her independence and extended her territorial boundaries. So the Italians found themselves within Kenyan territory, which was great, because then they came to the Kenyan government and asked if we could enter into a partnership for the development of space activities within Kenya. And so the launch platform is no longer in use, but there were about 28 launches from that platform right up to 1989. And then there's a ground segment that is still hosted on the Kenyan coast, and is co-run by between the Kenyan and Italian government. And right now, of course, with the Kenya Space Agency, we are actively involved in that. In terms of the setup, the Kenya Space Agency was established in the year 2017 by executive order. And as I explained earlier, I'm part of the board that we're basically the founding member. The assignment we were given is you need to set up a space agency within a period of about 3 to 6 years, and has to be up and running and provide a framework where we can actually commercialize and utilize space for the benefit of the Kenyan economy. So principally, the space agency's mandate is to coordinate, to regulate, and to provide a space within which we can establish the Kenyan space economy. We are looking at space technology as an enabler for our communications, our agriculture, security, and defense. In terms of what we have done for projects so far. I think the most interesting one was what happened this year. We actually had a team at the Kenya Space Agency build our first 3U satellite that was completely done by Kenyan engineers. And this was launched on 15th of April this year aboard the Falcon 9. It was a part of the rideshare. And the satellite is called Taifa-1. So it's in orbit, and we look forward to getting data that will support us in various sectors. Concurrently, we're also in the process of completing the setup of the receiving station. So that is underway. So those are, I would say, are the big items that we've actually pushed through in this particular year. I'd say I think the biggest challenge that I have observed from a personal level is human capacity. I think not only in Kenya, but across the continent, if we are really going to benefit and from the space economy and space industry, it will be critical for us to actually build our human capacity. So in terms of that, the Kenyan government actually has had sustained effort and a programmatic approach towards training the population in STEM related subjects. So we do have quite a number of technical universities where we are looking to have the future players of the space industry in Kenya. So I think I'll stop right there because I think that's quite a bit already, but anybody who would want to really then go through the history and look at this data, the information is also available on the Kenya Space Agency website. So this is public information, it's available, and you can have a look at the strategy and our guiding documents, and also the opportunities available to actually intersect with the Kenyan space industry. Thank you, Laura.
I have two follow-up questions. The first one is how do you see Kenya within the continental efforts? Do you think Kenya will or is taking a leading role in those efforts? And relatedly, could you maybe explain why the decision was made to base the African agency in Egypt and not in another country? Thank you.
Okay, so I think in terms of the role of Kenya, Kenya is actually the powerhouse, the economic powerhouse of East Africa. So generally, we tend to give the lead to within the East African region, and I think our approach is collaborative and a cooperative one. So we're happy to lead, we are happy to engage in helping other nations that would want to, actually come up and develop their space sectors. And I'm sure the audience is well aware, if you've been following the news in Africa, we have quite a number of countries that have also made attempts at launching nanosats, small satellites. So we have Zimbabwe, we have Uganda. We have our neighbor to the north, Ethiopia, which has quite a robust technical project on satellites. And of course, we have Nigeria. So for us, within our immediate region is actually East Africa. And we are open to collaboration and supporting other states within the region in the development of our space program. Sorry, Laura, I think you asked the second question and I didn't, yes. Could you come again? I think yes, I didn't quite get it.
No, I was wondering why Egypt and what Egypt.
Oh, okay. So I don't think I really have an answer for that. Maybe the other panelists could, but I would say at Egypt, there was a conversation around where we should host the space agency, and Egypt came forward and said, we have an allocation, a budgetary allocation, and offered to to actually set up and host the African Space Agency. So at least that's a part of the conversation I know about. And as I said, for us, cooperation within Africa is critical. So I think the decision was not one where we had a vote. At least I don't remember that going through a voting process and saying, okay, now we're going to pick this nation. I just remember that Egypt actually stepped forward and said, we can do this for Africa.
Thank you. Yes, I mean, I'm based in Latin America, and it's a bit similar. I mean, each country has their own projects, but now there are efforts of creating something on a regional level to have more strength together. So it's interesting to see that different regions are doing have similar considerations. So maybe Ruvimbo, you can tell us a little bit about Zimbabwe and your region.
Certainly. First, to start by noting that the Zimbabwean space program is executed by the Zimbabwe National and Geospatial Space Agency, which was launched in 2018. Their primary mandate was for land management, and it served sort of as a policy innovation to support the broader agricultural strategy in the country. As we know, Zimbabwe was formerly the breadbasket of Africa, but due to climate change and other socio-political issues, this has since fallen away. However, the space program will serve to sort of fill that data gap, especially in terms of the creation of a national spatial data infrastructure, which will help to support various government ministries. And some studies have been conducted and proposed for the integration of geospatial and especially statistical information to support socioeconomic development. As Joan already mentioned, the first satellite was launched in 2022 for research and development, and this will be closely followed by another satellite soon, presumably for Earth observation, again, to support the broader aims of not only the region, but of course the climate change related needs. The agency is linked to or partnered with the University of Zimbabwe, serving as an innovation hub. And again, this speaks to, as Joan mentioned, the need for workforce development and training of the skilled personnel. So we look forward to seeing what developments come in that regard. But with regards to the African space industry, which is growing stronger than ever, I'd like to reiterate that Earth observation remains our main sort of industry market, and there's a growing desire to commercialize various services within that market. So we're seeing, of course, the diversification of downstream capabilities, but also upstream capabilities with a lot of investment in critical infrastructure. And I'd like to tie this to the question about Egypt as sort of the hub for the African Space Agency, and just look at their national space strategy, which seems to be not only positioning them as a global player, but also that critical investment in infrastructure, namely manufacturing, assembly, integration, and testing facilities, I think is what makes Egypt stand apart, as well as also their international partnerships, where they recently partnered with China on said facilities as well, and they continue to have interagency engagement. So I think also their strong economy plays into that, and they're one of the fastest growing and largest economies with a very strong flight heritage in space. So I think all of these factors must have fed into the decision. But as we continue to grow regionally, I think important factors to look at are the building of strong institutions like the African Space Agency. And this agency should be able to deliver on the need for quality data, especially Earth observation data. An interesting tool that I think can be employed for this is the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which came into force in 2021 and is expected to combine a total market of 1.3 billion people and a combined GDP of 3.4 trillion United States dollars. So if we do have this fully implemented, it could potentially lift 30 million Africans out of extreme poverty and increase the income of the continent by at least 470 billion by 2035. I mentioned the FCAFTA because the space industry is an industry capable of trade and investment like any other, so it deserves that much attention. And of course, to back this, we need appropriate financing support. And we see that the African VC market is also coming up. I'd like to also mention, as Joan alluded to, competitive collaboration is a new term that I've learned recently, which is understanding the need for national sovereignty and building of local capabilities, but also doing so in a way that spurs our neighbors and our region to strive for international best practices and standards. So to that end, I certainly hope that not only the AFCAFTA, but the policies, the African Space Policy and Strategy and other coming documents and initiatives will serve to inspire that growth in Zimbabwe and Africa as a whole.
Thank you. This is very interesting. I'm learning a lot. I hope the audience as well. With regard to the role of Zimbabwe, so Joan mentioned that Kenya is also helping neighboring countries to develop their projects. Is Zimbabwe also taking a similar role within its direct neighbors, or is it more?
I would say it's a bit
individual?
early to tell, since it's still early days. It's a nascent space industry. But I would say certainly setting itself up as a research and development hub is something that Zimbabwe looks forward to, with a very educated populace and a desire to use space to demonstrate STEM capacity in Zimbabwe. So much to look forward to there.
Thank you. And Josh, could you maybe tell us a little bit about Nigeria and West Africa more generally?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's my opportunity to do that. It's my privilege to do that.
Josh, we cannot hear you very well, so maybe.
Can you hear me now? Is it clearer?
Maybe try with the other headphone you had earlier.
I'll take a while. Let me just fix this. Yeah, I think it's okay.
I just changed the audio. How is it now? The microphone rather. Is it better?
It's much better. Yes, thank you.
All right. So yeah, Nigeria has always been interested in space. As far back as I think the 1970s. But then what Nigeria had was just an ambition. But the ambition was brought into life in the early 2000s. So Nigeria's space program started much earlier than related to other African countries. Nigeria, I think, Nigeria launched its first satellites in 2003. I think it was an Earth observation satellite. That satellite is very famous for taking one of the first pictures of Hurricane Katrina. One of the very first pictures, because the satellites, Nigeria through the satellite joined the DMC, a disaster monitoring constellation. So the satellite was one of the satellites in the constellation that took the first pictures of Hurricane Katrina. So it's one of the first things that helped show Nigeria the importance of space. Going down, Nigeria also established its space agency, the National Space Research and Development Agency, in 2010, and it was coupled with the establishing principle, with the establishing legislation. So Nigeria is one of the few African countries to have an actual legislative framework for space. And more than just that, Nigeria has also realized the importance of commercializing the space industry. This has led to the 2015 regulations on licensing space activities. So Nigeria already offers the legislative framework to enable commercialization in space. Other than that, Nigeria's satellite communication segment is also growing with NIGCOMSAT. NIGCOMSAT currently partners with Thales Alenia and ASECNA for space augmentation SPAS system in Africa, and they've had a lot of trials and it has been very, very successful. In terms of goals, Nigeria's space strategy has changed over the years, and it has responded to different social and environmental challenges. If anyone is familiar with Nigeria, one of the most common problems that Nigeria faces is terrorism, Boko Haram. And because of this need, because of the nature of this challenge, the Nigerian military has found itself relying more and more on space technology to combat this challenge. And Nigeria has leveraged this ability, has used this ability for conflict in the region as well. The conflict, I can't remember the countries in particular, but Nigeria has been able to leverage its satellite capacities, because Nigeria actually also has a very expansive Earth observation. If you recall the incidents with the Hurricane Katrina, Nigeria also has a very expansive Earth observation program. But currently, Nigeria is looking to expand its Earth observation into military purposes. And that's why the most recent satellite launched in Nigeria was launched by the military, the DELSAT. It's an integrated satellite that should help, that aims to help military with its aims of reducing terrorism in the country. Other than that, Nigeria is also very invested in capacity development. Nigeria was one of the first beneficiaries of the Cable Cube, initiative, launching the Nigeria Sat-1, Nigeria EduSat-1. It's the name, the Nigerian Education Satellite. Because of my niche knowledge, I'm familiar with what the satellite actually did in space. I'm not going to tell you that, but it was very perfect for what we wanted to do. We wanted to develop a capacity, and we did develop a capacity, which is one of the benefits, the advantages of programs like the Cable Cube and other programs that the UN is using to increase access to space. Nigeria is also, moving away from Nigeria, in the West African region, we also see that Cote d'Ivoire is also looking to kickstart space program. But to the best of my knowledge, Cote d'Ivoire is looking inward, because I believe the country knows its specific need and is looking inward to develop space as an answer to its socioeconomic problems, which is what Africa is really doing. So one thing that is common in Africa, in terms of Africa's reaction to space development, is that different countries have different priorities. So development in space is not necessarily, it's not unilateral, it's not uniform. And this is where AFSA comes in. So far, so good. AFSA, that's the African Space Agency, is looking towards developing the space industry. And if you go through the African Space Agency's establishing treaty, you can see that AFSA wants to focus on intra-African partnership, which I think is still somewhere Africa is failing. Not so much failing as struggling. Like Ruvimbo mentioned, the AFCTA is also another means. But the African Space Agency has recently just been operationalized, I think earlier this year. It takes a while for them to get up to speed. But after getting up to speed, we can hope and expect that the agency can serve as a rallying point, which is something Africa has desperately needed to develop and be able to compete and provide, actually not even compete, because currently Africa is not looking to compete. Africa is looking to use space to develop its social and economic status. So that's about it for now. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to hear it.
Yes, actually, I have a follow-up question. I don't know if you know the answer. If not, no worries. But I was wondering, could you maybe give us a list of the countries that have strong space projects at the moment in Africa, just to have an idea of which countries we are talking about?
Well, strong is relative. The adjective I prefer to use is better in development, just at a higher stage of development, because really everyone is developing. But if I were to name them, I would say Egypt, like as you already heard. Egypt was a no-brainer, really. And I remember correctly, I think there was different countries raised signified interest in hosting the African Space Agency, but they currently have a plan. And it's easy to see the plan. Egypt is also developing one of the first manufacturing, assembly, integration, and testing facility in Africa. Egypt is also one of the first African countries to develop its own satellite capabilities. Egypt has launched not one, not two satellites that it has developed in-house, which is not something a lot of African countries can boast of. Even Nigeria. What Nigeria has done is get its engineers out there to work with through this technology transfer principle. I remember very vividly with satellite technology. It was part of the contract that, while SSTL is building Nigeria satellite, Nigerian engineers can also use that journey as a career boost to develop their capacity. But Egypt is leading in this regard, and Egypt, it's also very easy to measure how important Egypt sees space and how much it spends. By my most recent knowledge, Egypt allocates about $40 million per year on a space program. And moving from that, it's also easy to see Algeria in this regard, because Algeria allocated about $1 billion over a period of 10 years for the space program. And Algeria is also one country in Africa that is doing a lot. Algeria has launched about 6 satellites. Your website is very functional. You can see that there is growth, there is activity in the industry. South Africa as well. As South Africa is hosting the SK, what more can you ask for? The SK, where completed, will be one of the biggest telescope systems in the world. And South Africa also is very, very important in astronomy in the world. The South African telescopes, the SALT telescope, I can't remember the full name, and then the 10mm telescope, all in South Africa have been useful in discovering different astronomical phenomena. Most lately is I think it was a paper published on Nature about ORCs, odd radio circles. So the current team is from the team that published the report leveraged South Africa's telescope abilities to develop that very insightful and eventually, if correct, very impactful study. So other than that, South Africa is also very, very developed in terms of the satellite capacity. I interacted with someone here, professors here hosted, and I believe in my interaction, what I learned was that because of the whole apartheid issue there in South Africa was locked in the country, so they couldn't cooperate with other countries. But South Africa still realized the importance of space, so they were forced to look inward. And because of that, South Africa has one of the best, in my opinion, one of the best capacity developments in space in Africa. Because one of the first satellites launched in Africa, which was the first satellite South Africa launched in 1999, some Bandela Sat, I can't place the name. It was a project of the University of Stellenbosch. That was as far back as 1999. Going with this, we can say these are the countries. South Africa also, South Africa's budget is also very, I guess, one of the most in the last 5 years for Africa. If I recall correctly, South Africa is always budgeting north of $100 million every year for its space program, and it's easy to see why. South Africa also has one of the most expansive legal framework in Africa as regards to space. It has the Astronomy Geography Act. It has well over 4 or 5 specific legislative instruments that help to cater for the South African space industry. And it's very, very easy to see because South Africa has the best or has the most new space companies in Africa, especially the hardware, where the hardware side of the space industry, where you need a lot of engineering, where it actually gets technical. So I hope I haven't been rambling for too long, but I think that should give us an idea of the countries that, should I say, started space first, because all that happened is these countries took interest in space much earlier than the rest of Africa. That's really just it.
Actually, so you mentioned new space companies, and this brings me to my next question, because we have looked a little bit at the interest of governments to develop the space sector in Africa, but I was wondering if we could also maybe speak about the private sector. So you mentioned South Africa, but I was wondering, how is the private sector in Nigeria and in West Africa in general? Are there companies that are starting to go into the space sector or not so much?
In my experience, I've realized that Africa is very similar to Europe, in the sense that the primary satellite missions are done by the government. Faleti and linear space, I think Faleti. Airbus is owned by European governments. There's the ESA, the Copernicus. Most fundamental space programs are being done by the government. So much is the same in Africa. Perhaps for the same reason, perhaps because only the government in Africa can afford the capital, to begin to leverage space. But currently in Nigeria, I would relate it to other African countries. Nigeria's space commercial sector is not where it needs to be. But it's not so much an issue of the Nigerian space sector, so much as it is the Nigerian economy. So looking at Nigeria will not give you a good idea of how the space sector is developing in Africa, how the commercial space sector is developing in Africa. For that, you look at Kenya. Kenya has one of the most downstream new space companies in Africa. It's I believe Joan mentioned the Taifa one. Taifa one, if I recall correctly, I met with some of the engineers back in 2021, and what they were doing was very, very lovely. It was needed to see that the Kenyan environment and then the Kenyan government encouraged them. But not so much borders. Moving away from Kenya, we have South Africa. And South Africa has a very, very healthy, it's world class in my opinion. South Africa has a very healthy new space environment. They export to the US, the likes of Cube Space, the likes of Dragonfly Aerospace, the likes of Chimera Space. These are very, very big. They are competing globally already. It's just very unfortunate that Africa can't seem to tap into their commercial markets for several reasons. Well, I hope that has answered your question.
Yeah, thank you very much. Maybe Joan can comment a little bit on the Kenyan private space sector that Josh mentioned.
Okay, yeah, great. Thank you, Josh, for that. So actually, it is true that Taifa One was actually built as a collaboration. It was actually a public-private partnership collaboration between Kenyan Space Agency, Sayari Labs, with the support of Endurosat. So there is, so in Kenya, outside of the Kenya Space Agency framework, we do have quite a robust private sector engagement dealing with mostly downstream applications. So we have a lot of private companies that are engaged in the downstream applications, provision of services. So one of our mandates at Kenya Space Agency is actually a regulatory mandate in accordance to our establishing executive order. So some of the work we're doing to actually create a more clearly defined regulatory space is reviewing the law. And the Kenya Space Bill will actually make clear, well, it will be the Kenya Space Act, currently a bill, will actually make it much clearer for how commercial operations will be undertaken in Kenya related to the space sector. So currently that regulatory function or mandate cannot be fully executed because the establishing instrument for the Kenya Space Agency is a subsidiary law instrument itself. So it's not a principal act. And so you cannot draw regulatory powers from a subsidiary instrument. So that's some of the work we're doing to actually then create a full regulatory framework where we'll be able to harness and bring all these private sector actors under an umbrella where they know what the rules are, and also with clear rules in the playing field. I believe then it will attract more companies to come into the Kenyan market. So yeah, thank you, Josh, and you're quite right about your analysis of the Kenyan market. I think actually for a long time we had the Kenyan private sector taking a role in developing the space economy, so quite vibrant. And I'm excited to see where it's going to go in the future, especially when we have a clearer regulatory framework.
Thank you very much. And Ruvimbo, so we heard a lot about South Africa from Josh. So I was wondering also if you could comment a little bit on the relationship with regard to space cooperation between Zimbabwe and South Africa, and maybe tell us a little bit more about the private sector in the South African region.
Certainly, I can't speak too much to it as not a lot has been shared to this point. What I do understand is there is some underlying memorandum of understanding between Zimbabwe and South Africa for space cooperation, which of course feeds into the broader diplomatic ties. I think just as every other sector as well, it's looking to not only develop its market, but finance its market as well. It started off with an initial grant of $10 million from the Ministry of Finance. It's unsure what the budgetary allocations have been ever since then. But of course, the desire to meet the high capital demands of the industry will be something that will not only feed into the government program, but I think also private sector financing as well. And if I can sort of direct to the broader conversation of Africa, these discussions on both the regulatory and the socio-political factors were all discussed at the New Space Africa conference, which took part in Abidjan, Cote d'Ivoire this year. And what we saw were there were three dominant conversations that were had for how to grow Africa's broader space market. And the first was, of course, and as already alluded to, the consolidation of Africa's Earth observation market was the first. And then the second being the need for enabling policy frameworks to support especially emerging technologies, which, as already mentioned by my colleagues, is something that's being worked on in South Africa with not only space policies, but also policies for affiliated markets. So for instance, they have an Electronic Communications Act, which also feeds into broader data and communications policies. Or for instance, Kenya, which has the private sector bill to support the industry. And then lastly, there was discussions on how we can diversify the market towards critical infrastructure and investments. And I'm drawing from some figures at Space in Africa here just to demonstrate that the new space industry is growing. There are 318 different new space companies. And we see that as of June 2023, there are at least 15 African nations that have invested well over or near to $5 billion in 58 satellite projects. And as well, we're seeing there's a shift to investment in critical infrastructure, and we're seeing these discussions on the midstream, especially such as ground stations, teleports, etc. All this to say, and just to reiterate, as Josh already mentioned, is that the global space race may be premised on one thing, but the African race, or really journey rather, is more premised on space being used for SDGs through an interesting business model that can be classified as a research public-private partnership, which has the important element of the research foundation, which we see is tied to a lot of initiatives, especially in Earth observation, such as the GMES in Africa program, which has, of course, funding to support 12 different consortia across the continent. And just to also add on to other space or strong space countries that would be of interest, already mentioned Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa. And we could also add in there as well, I would say Angola, which recently launched its second satellite in partnership, of course, with Russia, and received substantial funding and workforce development for their local capabilities. Tunisia as well, which is supporting especially small sat development. We have Tanzania, which had their Space Education Summit recently, and the space agency was announced and a probable satellite to come soon. And as well, Ethiopia, which has a strong astronomy background as well as flight heritage. Rwanda, of course, is building private sector development as well, wanting to get the private sector involved through what's called space innovation ecosystem development. They're working closely with partners for that. And Ghana, of course, recently launched its national space policy, becoming, I believe, if not the 10th country, 10th or 11th to do so. So there are quite a few countries that are demonstrating a will to climb up the ladder of development. I'll end with a brief point to say that space development is a continuum. So while there are some countries that are on research and development, others yet are on tech development, and yet more are on innovation, etc. Being on one end of the development continuum does not negate from the progress. In fact, you can oscillate. And I think it's important that each country sort of hones into whichever talent or capability that is most strongest in that regard. And there will still be private sector support necessary at each level of development. So I appreciate all of the different efforts from where they are beginning, and I hope that all of these different private sector discussions can evolve at each milestone.
Thank you very much for this overview. It's very impressive how much you all know about the regional background as well, because I think it's easy to know about your own country, but not necessarily about the whole region. And because this is a space arbitration webinar, I have to ask about disputes. So I understand that maybe there haven't been any, or you are not expecting many disputes in the near future. But I was just wondering, do you think that the private sector companies active in space are aware of arbitration, or if they would be facing a dispute either with another private company or with a government entity, would they go to a court, or do they include arbitration clauses in their contracts? Do you know anything about that? Maybe starting with Joan.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Thank you very much, Laura. I try to, think about, the title of the webinar being space arbitration. I think I really try to think around what the practice would be in Africa. And maybe let's just start from terrestrial arbitration, and then we can build up on that. So my general comments, having been an active practitioner within the litigation and arbitration space, both domestically and internationally, on behalf of the Kenyan government, would be that I think arbitration practice in Africa is still building up. I'm just speaking from two recent arbitration conferences that happened, one in Zanzibar and the other one last week in Nairobi. I would say there's been a general and gradual development of arbitration practice within the African continent. So far, at least I'm aware that only Kenya, Tanzania, and Nigeria have actually successfully mounted defenses in arbitrations and won. So during my time practicing litigation and arbitration, we did have as Kenya several matters that went on to international arbitration. Generally, from an African perspective, I would say from experience that I think there's a preference towards ad hoc arbitration style as opposed to institutional arbitration. And the unfortunate reason for this has been the sort of suboptimal outcomes that many African states have actually had to deal with when they've engaged in institutional arbitration. So coming down to Kenya, I would say that we have a very robust arbitration practice. In fact, one of our former attorney generals, Professor Githu Muigai, is an international recognized chartered arbitrator, and had been the lead counsel during his time as attorney general in several of these international arbitrations. We also have the Nairobi Center of International Arbitration, which is a body established by statute. And the rules of this particular center tend towards the UNCITRAL rule. So that's the ad hoc system, more or less. And most of the companies dealing within Kenya, in the commercial contracts, we really do encourage arbitration. It's also the preferred dispute resolution mechanism that that we do incorporate into our commercial agreements, even from a government perspective. So I think coming down to the space sector, I don't, oh yes, and sorry, before I forget, as drawing down from our constitutional provisions within our litigation system, especially in the commercial litigation system, we actually have rules that mandate our courts, where applicable, to refer disputes to arbitration or alternative dispute resolution mechanism if the parties consent to doing that. So you can see that's already also entrenched within our dispute resolution systems in Kenya. So coming back to space, I would say for the future, I do see a lot of, and even for the existing frameworks we have so far, I do see a lot of companies tending towards alternative dispute resolution mechanisms. Also, because when these entities are not necessarily Kenyan, I think there's more faith, if I could call it that, in dispute resolution mechanisms that don't necessarily depend on the litigation systems within the Kenyan state or the other party state. I think it's a safe option, or rather it's viewed as a safe option between parties. So I do see that in the future, this will be an area that will be used in commercial agreements within the space sector in Kenya. And I mean, I look forward to seeing how it's all going to develop within this jurisdiction. But those are my general comments when it comes to arbitration and having, been part of my practice in the earlier part of my career. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. I don't know if you could maybe just in one phrase summarize whether your jurisdictions are pro-arbitration, or if arbitration is not yet very well known, that would be great. Maybe Ruvimbo.
I believe the jurisdiction is pro-arbitration, although niche. I think it feeds into the broader industry, which is continuing to develop, especially on the grounds of arbitration and mediation for outer space disputes. As Joan mentioned, I think it goes down to the wider adoption of the ancestral rules, as well as the New York Convention and the Singapore Convention, especially, which I think the latter only has about 55 signatories. So to that end, I think the whole of Africa needs to consider to what extent it can support investor confidence by not only acceding to these principles and domesticating them, but also feeding into the broader narrative of how would this relate to a technical industry.
Thank you very much. Josh, I don't know if you have anything to add to this.
Well, unfortunately, I'll try to make it as short as possible because I was thinking about a lot of things when you asked Joan. But for me, can you hear me?
Not as well as before.
Wow, now I forgot to put on. Can you hear me now? Is it better now? All right. It's difficult to say that Africa is, at least Nigeria, is interested in arbitration, especially as regards to space, primarily because we haven't gotten there yet. And I feel it still goes back to the issue of the government being responsible for space activities. Arbitration, as I understand it, is very commercial in nature. Nigeria, that still very much relies on a more governmental approach to space. Is less likely to take an arbitration approach, especially when it relates to other countries. Other than that, I've also gone through Nigeria. Because Nigeria has a commercial guideline for satellite communication. And in the event of disputes, because I went through it looking for any form of dispute resolution, and it's obvious that there's really none. They haven't really, the drafters didn't really consider it. But it's obvious that it did not see the need to. If you go through the body of the guidelines, commercial guidelines, it's obvious that the body that came up with the guidelines did not foresee the importance of arbitration. It just only understands that, okay, we need the commercial sector. Hasn't really understood that the commercial sector works hand in hand with arbitration. But I think the issues should still persist in Africa, because be it as it may, the government will still always, the government plays the heavy lifting in the African space industry. And for that, I think it's more about ratifying the Reliability Convention, the Outer Space Treaty, and the rest. And I think a lot of African countries have indeed ratified the Outer Space Treaty. A lot of African countries are parties to the Outer Space Treaty. But I believe that it's something that Africa would get to eventually. With the rise of the commercial sector, I believe the commercial sector always wants what's easiest for it. And in no time, they will develop their arbitration rules. Thank you.
Yeah.
Was that short enough?
No, thank you. Yeah, I agree. I think usually with a growing commercial sector, comes the request for more arbitration. But I guess maybe we reconvene in a few years and see if there have been developments in this area. But thank you really very, very much. I learned a lot. It was a great webinar today. So thank you for accepting our invitation. And with that, I'll hand the microphone back over to Thorsten. Thank you, Thorsten.